Welcome to week 9. This week we'll go over more methods from the document object model. Some of this will be a review of week 6. However, it's that important that we go over both last week and this week's new methods. So let's get started. Again, the document object model is a hierarchical tree representation of a document. If you see the diagram, you'll see a representation of an HTML page. Then we have two different threads, one toward the head tag and one toward the body tag. And here you see the title tag is a descendant of the head tag. Similarly, H1 and P are descendant or child of the body tag. H1 and P are siblings to one another, and the body tag is a parent of the H1 and P tags. The DOM is a collection of nodes that represent the entire web page. Nodes is the key word here, and JavaScript is one of the languages that can change the document object model. So again, the most commonly used node types are the document, which only has element nodes as a child node, because all nodes are children of that document. There's the element, which can have an element, text, comment, node as a child node. If you recall from our homework assignment, we looped around all nodes in a form to do form validation. The ATTR is an attribute of an element, and that can have a text node as a child node. So when we have an attribute that equals something, that value that it equals is a child node of that attribute. There's also a text node type. That would be the text inside an element, an attribute, comment. That's at the lowest level, so it has no child nodes at all. Think about a paragraph tag that has text in it. The text would be the lowest element in that paragraph tag, regardless of whether it has a text level inline element, something like a bold tag or a span tag. Regardless, the text is the lowest element and therefore has no child nodes. So let's talk about node properties. Well, whatever the node value is, it will return the text for text, attribute, or comment. It's almost like inner HTML if it were only HTML, if it were only text, not HTML. The parent node returns the parent of the node. The child node returns an array of the node objects that are children of that element. The first child returns a node object for the first child node. So if we had a div tag that had numerous paragraph tags, the first child would return that first paragraph, which would be the first child node. We'll see this in our code examples that come with this week's handouts. The last child would, of course, be the node object for the last child node. The next element sibling would be the neighboring node object for that sibling. So if we had 5 paragraph tags inside a div tag, and we isolated that first div tag, isolated that first paragraph tag, the second paragraph tag would be the next element sibling. If node exists, it always returns null in JavaScript. We already know the getElementById method for the document interface, and last week we began to learn about the elements by tag name. This is just a review of that. Be careful, because elements always need to have that S, because it will be plural. This returns an array of elements that matches the tag name value. So if I were to get elements by tag name input, I would get all input tags. So getElementsByTagName by tag name returns an array of elements that matches that tag name value. This slide is effective because it shows the for loop that would loop through all input tags. Notice the length property on the end of the getElementsByTagName input. Again, arrays are zero-based, and those input types would be an array. We want to go to the less than value because of the zero index. So if we were to get elements by tag name input I value, and we were to apply this loop on the code above, we would get whatever the value is on those input types. So the method of document interface getElementsByName would only grab the name field. So in this case, we have an input name title. That's an array of 3 titles. All of those names are called title. And it's a radio button collection, which is why they have the same name. So let's say we used getElementsByName and wanted to loop around them. Well, that too is an array. The following code example at the bottom of the slide would determine if any title was checked in a radio button collection that had the name title. So once again, if document.getElementsById title.length is the terminator of this loop, we can get each element by name and figure out its check property. If it is, the title OK is true. This was reflected in homework that was due this week. By isolating the radio buttons and checkboxes and looping through them to see if they were checked, we could turn on a toggle to say that, yes, this radio group is OK and valid. There's also getElementsByClassName. This also returns an array of elements that matches whatever the class name value is. So if I were to do document getElementsByClassName and use ERR, I would get all elements that have a class of ERR. And here is an example of a loop that does the same thing. The first child node value of this would still be an array. It would be the text of whatever the error message is. So for each one of these values, if they happen to have an error, we might append a specific message and make that node value equal. So when we use document getElementById dot next element sibling, we will find that ID and usually find the next sibling. The sibling will not be before the name, it'll be after. So our best example is the span class error messaging that follows the input type text. This also is reflected in our homework that was due this week. So in the code example, we test to see if we can display an error message without using an ID. So if we get the ElementById fname, and if that's equal to empty, what we can do is use the document getElementById fname, next sibling, first child node value equals please enter your first name. The methods of element interface also has something called a has attribute. This will return true if an element has the attribute specified in the attribute name. So let's say we have an attribute called class. Well, if we test to see if that has an attribute called class, then it would have that attribute and would test positive. There are also methods of the element interface that have setAttribute. In this case, it takes 2 parameters, the attribute name and the value. I use this a lot for hyperlinks, the ahref tag. You can set it to be a unique value in JavaScript. In this case, we have a class that equals red that has an inner text of dogs. In this case, we're setting that attribute to be font size 1.5 EM. We can also remove an attribute. In this case, we have a attribute class equals red for dogs. We can remove it and apply it to another attribute. This will be new to you because it's not in the textbook. There are 2 methods called querySelector and querySelectorAll. Let's look at some examples. If we wanted to access the first myClass class name, what we could do is use the document object and the querySelector method and pass into it a string that has the dot indicator for class and myClass. That would get the first myClass class name. If we wanted an actual list of all instances of myClass, we could use the querySelectorAll method. If we wanted to just access something that has an ID called myID, we would use querySelector. If we wanted a list of all div tags, we'd use query selector all. Lastly, the last list node of some list unordered list would be query selector, and it would find the UL, and then a class called SumList inside that UL, and then an LI, and then the last child. It's very similar to the pseudo classes that you learned in CSS class. So this is an example of query selector all. We've got two paragraph tags. One is hello world, and one is the DOM is very useful. Well, if we find all p tags with the query selector all method, what we can do is loop around all those elements and apply a new style with the color that equals green. Incidentally, we've only done this twice in this class, where we add the style method or property of an object and then its specific value color. These are also methods of the document interface. There are three of them: create element, create text node, and append child. So if we wanted to create a new div element, we might say something like document, create element, div. Or if we wanted to do a bold element, we could do new b equals document, create element b. Then we can give it some content. For example, we could do document, create text node, hello from a new b. Now that new text node is inside the new content variable. And all we'd have to do is append the child with the new content to new b. Then we would have a bold tag that has hello from a new b. We can also add the newly created element and its content into the DOM. For example, if we wanted to create or get an element by ID para and put it in a variable, we could append the child that we just created, new b, to that paragraph. This is a paragraph ID that is para, and we can add an element to the page inside this paragraph. So what we've done here is on click, add an element to the page, and now we have hello from a new b to that paragraph element. We created the text node, appended the child to the b tag, and created. So let's say we had an array of 4 dogs: Missy, Daisy, Andy, and Letty. Then we put that list into a variable called myArray. Well, what we can do is loop around that array, and on each turn of the loop, access each name. And we can create a text node with that name. We can create a text node that's a break tag. And then we can append the child that's the text and the child that's the break tag. And what you see on the right is the new HTML.